Erev Tov, everybody. Happy Hanukkah. Great to be together. I just came back a little while ago from the Times Square Shine a Light gathering. Second year they're doing it, and very meaningful and heartening, and maybe a little bit related to the end of this essay, which tackles anti-Semitism in a certain way, as Rav Meidan has done in a couple of other places. Here we go. I'll share my screen. We'll get started. It's a medium length this week. Shnot Hara'av b'Mitzrayim, the years of famine in Egypt. From when the 7 years of famine begin, the biblical story divides into two parallel tracks, two parallel stories. The first is the famine as it's experienced in the land of Canaan, in the midst of the family of Yaakov Avinu. And the essence of that story is the two trips down to Egypt to procure food, one without Binyamin and the second with him. Yosef's revealing himself to his brothers, Yaakov going down to Egypt and meeting his son Yosef. That's all sort of consequence of the famine. The second story describes the famine as it's experienced in Egypt and the fate of the Egyptian residents. The Torah goes to great lengths with the first story, really chapters 42 to 47, and ends briefly with the second story, the second half of chapter 47. We're going to begin our analysis specifically with the second story, and therefore we are going to skip to Parashat Vayigash, and that's where the bulk of the time actually will be spent. So it kind of works since next week we won't be learning together. Our family will be in Florida. So this essay is doing double duty for Vayigash as well. And this is from Vayigash, from chapter 47, verses 13 to 26. I'll put it up in Sefaria so you can follow along in Hebrew or English. There was no bread in the whole world, for the famine was very severe. The land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished because of the famine. Yosef gathered in all the money that was to be found in the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan as payment for the rations that were being procured, and brought the money into Pharaoh's palace. When there was no money left in Egypt and in Canaan, the Egyptians came to Yosef and said, now at this point sort of Canaan kind of disappears, and said, give us bread lest we die before your very eyes, for the money is gone. And Yosef said, bring your livestock, and I will sell to you against your livestock if the money is gone. So they brought their livestock to Yosef. Yosef gave them bread in exchange for the horses, for the stocks of sheep and cattle and the asses. Thus he provided them with bread that year in exchange for all their livestock. When that year was ended, they came to him the next year and said to him, we cannot hide from my lord that with all the money and animal stocks consigned to my lord, nothing is left at my lord's disposal, save our persons and our farmland. That's all we have left in our own possession. Let us not perish before your eyes, we and our land. Take us and our land in exchange for bread, and we with our land will be serfs to Paro, Abadim to Paro. Provide the seed that we may live and not die, and that the land may not become a waste. So Yosef gained possession of the farmland of Egypt for Paro, all the Egyptians having sold their fields because the famine was too much for them. Thus the land passed over to Paro. He removed the population town by town from one end of Egypt's border to the other. Only the land of the priests did he not take over, for the priests had an allotment from Paro, and they lived off the allotment which Paro had made to them. Therefore, they did not sell their land. Then Yosef said to the people, whereas I have this day acquired you and your land for Paro, here is seed for you to sow the land. And when harvest comes, you should give 1/5 to Paro, and 4/5 shall be yours as seed for the fields, and as food for you and those in your households, and as nourishment for your children. We're going to come back to that 4/5, 1/5 arrangement a little bit later. And they said, you have saved our lives. We are grateful to my Lord, and we shall be serfs to Paro. Yosef made it into a land law in Egypt, Chok al Admat Mitzrayim, which is still valid, that 1/5 should be Paro's. Only the land of the priests did not become Paro's. Our great forebears, and here Rav Meidan refers to Rashi and Ramban, argued over the question of how many years of famine are being described here. According to Rashi, we're here only talking about the first 2 years of famine. Immediately they come to Yosef, everything is dried out and they need help. And they do that first sale of the livestock, and then the second sale of the land. Those happen in the first 2 years. And when Yaakov went down to Mitzrayim, the Nile was blessed at his feet, and years of plenty resumed. According to this approach, Yosef's interpretation of the 7 years of famine never was totally fulfilled. He doesn't get in at length into the meaning of this debate per se, but it's interesting to think about the consequences of the two opinions. On the other hand, according to the Ramban, what's being described here is a 7-year period, and the money and the livestock didn't get used up right away. It took 5 or 6 years for that to happen. Then they come to Yosef. We have that year, and then the next year that makes up the entire, that starts at year 5 or 6, so that fills up those 7 years of famine. The Ramban praises the arrangement that Yosef did, the business dealings that he had with Egypt, greatly. When it says Yosef gathered all the money, the Ramban there says the Torah is telling this and sort of finishing up the whole portion in this way in order to let us know Yosef's incredible attributes of wisdom, insight, knowledge. He was a faithful servant who brought all this money to Paro's house. And he didn't make himself, storehouses of money or hidden treasures in Egypt or send it to the land of Canaan. He gave everything to the king who trusted in him, all that money, and bought for the king, all of that land and all of the people on it, who became then slaves. And even in this way, found favor in the eyes of the people, because God brings success to those who fear God. Right? So Yosef was, faithful. This is really a characteristic of Yosef that we kind of see throughout the biblical stories of him. He's faithful, trustworthy in whatever environment or setting he's in. So this is the Ramban's praise. But this business seems puzzling. This is one of Rav Meidan's buzzwords, timuha. It's strange, it's shocking, it's surprising. And amongst the modern commentaries, what he calls the Mefarshim HaChadashim, there were many who attacked Yosef for this. Yosef collects up all the produce from the fields of Egypt in the years of plenty. Why does he then sell it to them in the years of famine in exchange for their money, their livestock, their land, and their very selves? The very produce that he took from them in the years of famine. In the years of plenty, right? Well, he takes it from them in the years of plenty, it's theirs, and now he's selling it back to them and taking all of everything that belongs to them away. Many people saw in this the kind of autocracy of a kingdom, a kingship, a rulership against its citizens. It's kind of hegemony, maybe it's exercise of power and authority over them, and they accused, pointed guilt, assigned blame to Yosef for overturning the Egyptian nation and its land to be servants to Paro. And in this saw a justification for the enslavement of the Jewish people in Egypt at the time when a new dynasty came, as a vengeance, a retribution for Yosef's deeds. Long footnote here, in which Rav Meidan says that the kind of defense that the Ramban gives for Yosef's behavior, that he's doing this as a loyal servant to the king, is insufficient. And he says it reminds him of I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, the whole story of Yud Sus in Offenheim in Germany, which was a whole story of a kind of a officer, Jewish officer in the king's court who wound up collecting taxes for the king. And then when the Kaiser, whatever it was, and when that person died, he was attacked. And this became the kind of grounds for a horrifically anti-Semitic film in Germany in the, early to mid 20th century. So that sort of idea of the defense of, you were just doing the loyal thing for your overlord is not a sufficient defense. and has been turned against the Jews, on many occasions. So then he says, in my opinion, Ladati, and again, this is characteristic of Rav Meidan, where he's not afraid to critique, but in the end, he will often come around to try to defend the avot, even if it's, a different angle or a different take. He sees them as human, but he also wants to provide some justifiable basis for their actions. And he struggles with that sometimes, but he offers what he sees. So Ladati, in my opinion, God forbid that Yosef the Tzaddik would do, as corrupt an action as this against all of Egypt. And I'm not even sure that he had the power to do such a thing. It's possible that part of the kind of program of the plan that Yosef laid out in front of Paro at the time that he was interpreting his dreams, part of the plan that he laid out was to, protect the secrecy of the dream interpretation as a kind of state secret that Paro and his close counselors would have, who had heard the explanation of the dreams from Yosef. The years of the plenty started immediately. There was no announcement about how this was going to work. The years of the plenty started right on the heels of the dream interpretation. And so there was immediately a sharp decline in the cost of the grain, right? Because there was this tremendous surplus. Farmers had nothing to do with all of their surplus, and the agents of Paro bought it at a very, very low price, transferred it into these storehouses of Paro and preserved it well, until at the time of the famine, these storehouses were opened again. Then in the years of the famine, Yosef sold the grain, following the laws of supply and demand at a very, very high price. And in so doing, following legal economic means and the market fluctuations and fair economics, he transferred all of the Egyptian monies to the house of Paro. Okay, so starting off with sort of saying this wasn't a deception per se. It was all done fair and square on the face of it. But why would Yosef do this? Why didn't he just publicize from the get-go the interpretation of the dreams? And that's, the 7 years of famine, which were expected to come after the 7 years of plenty. Then every family could have, with its own power, stored their grains from the years of the plenty and had it for the years of the famine, right? So that would have been the simpler solution on the face of it. Amongst the commentaries, there are those who offer the explanation that the reason for this whole plan for not having, announced it, and thereby collecting all this, grain and then being able to buy the land and people of Egypt was, done at Yosef's behest, so that his brothers not feel like strangers in the land. Okay, Gemara and Chulin that says, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish said, there are many verses which we would think would be fit to be burned, and yet they are essential in the Torah. I didn't look up this Gemara, but it sort of seems to be saying, I don't know if fit to be burned means on the face of it heretical as much as it is sort of, irrelevant and don't seem to have any purpose in the Torah. Why do we need them? But in fact, they teach important lessons. But I have to double check that Gemara if that's the right reading of that first part. One such example, after some ellipsis, is our pasuk, towards the end when the people are transferred from their towns. What does this teach us? What do we get from here? What was the purpose of all of this? Delo liku la'achav galavata, that Yosef's brothers would not, feel like exiles in the land. In other words, if everybody is a stranger and is displaced from their land, then when Yosef's brothers come to Egypt, they don't feel like particular strangers. As you would imagine, and as Rav Meidan says, that is not a sufficient reason. He's pointing it out, to see that Chachamim were thinking about this question, but it's certainly not a sufficient reason to do something so perverted, so corrupt against all of the Egyptian nation. It seems to us that Yosef intended this whole Egyptian economic, project, initiative, from the get-go, in order to nationalize the lands and all the means of economic production, and to transfer all Egyptians from their places to other places, in order that all the Egyptians could enter into this emergency crisis economic program that would be managed by the government. Why would that be good? He didn't do this because of desire for power, but he did it because it was in his mind the only way to run the nation, run the country in a way which would not expand the, what do you call it, the poverty gap or the wealth poverty gap, in such a way that, the rich people wouldn't get richer and the poor people wouldn't get poorer. This is what happens when there are, radical market fluctuations and major and extreme changes in market movements. The people who are kind of ahead of the curve, entrepreneurial economically, and have a kind of good creative sense, know how to take advantage of these market, jumps for their benefit. They will store up the grain in the prosperous years in a more effective and better preserved way. And the other people who are not successful like them in the end are going to depend on the mercy, of the people who were more talented and more capable. And those people will take advantage of those, simple and poor people till they no longer have anything. That's kind of how the hidden hand of economics works everywhere. And the more extreme the economic crisis, the more the rich get richer and the poor and their economic means and prospects get poorer. In other words, or as we said, in order to prevent this, there was a need for a kind of a, state emergency state economic program, and for a, centralization of all the means of production and all the property into the hands of the state. Yosef was, practically speaking, the first communist. But what was different from other communist countries, in which all the wealth, was, gathered by the party leaders, instead of the economic, instead of the kind of agricultural leaders, and the party leaders, lived, wealthily, extravagantly, on the backs and on the bill, of the work of the class of laborers. Yosef actually carried this system out with righteousness and justice, with uprightness and with equality for all. The Egyptians could be analogized in the years of the famine to Bnei Israel when they went forth from Egypt in their years of wandering in the wilderness. Their food was the man which came down from heaven, and nobody was allowed to take more. We've learned this take of Rav Meidan's on the man and its role, sort of establishing kind of order and equality as a necessary transitional phase for this nation. We've seen that in Bamidbar, I believe, or maybe it was in Shemot. I don't remember now. So their bread was the man which came down from heaven, and nobody was allowed to take more than their daily portion for them and their families. Everybody was dependent on the table on high, God's table, and nobody could store the man for days of famine. In such a way, in the wilderness, there was this radical egalitarianism, between everybody when it comes to what they ate. Omer lagul golet, right? And Omer is measure per head, per person. Were it not for this, the rich and the talented would have found, a way to live better and to take advantage of their friends who were suffering from the famine in the wilderness, and taken everything from them for a few crumbs of their food. A proof to this, now we get back to an attempt to, ground, no pun intended, this in the text itself, and it's one word, but okay. A proof for this, that everything was done for the benefit of the nation and not in order to take advantage of it or fill its, Paro's coffers to full, is in the psukim on the division of the produce between Paro, after he became the owner of the land, and the Egyptians who worked on the land. So we're going to review those psukim. Yosef, this is 47 verses 23 to 25. Yosef said to the people, now I've acquired you and your land to Paro. Here is seed, and you'll sow the earth. And when it produces produce, you'll give a fifth to Paro, and 4 out of the 5 portions will be yours for seeding the field, for eating, for those who are in your home, for your children. And they said, Hechayitanu, you've given us life. Now, let's get one more paragraph before I react. So in the ancient world and in the Middle Ages as well, in the period of the feudal system in Europe, the vast majority of farmers were called tenant farmers or sharecroppers, on the lands of the aristocrats or nobles people. Everywhere we know, the general approach was that the owners of the land got the majority, the heart of the main portion of the produce, and the sharecropper who was working on their land got the minority of it. Yosef establishes, as an eternal rule, the opposite arrangement. The sharecropper gets 4/5, and the owner of the land gets 1/5 only. And indeed, the people recognized and expressed gratitude to Yosef for this new law, which was established in the benefit of the sharecroppers, when they said to him, Hechayitanu, you've given us life and sustenance. Now, again, hungry, terrified, impoverished people, even if they got a morsel, they might say, Hechayitanu. I don't know if we can build everything on that, but I think that point of contrasting the 4/5 in the direction of the, people whose land it was, versus other feudal systems, I think is a very good point and should impact how we're reading this story and seeing, the Yosef Paro initiative here. It's possible that there is a connection between the law that Yosef established on the land of Egypt and the law that the Torah establishes about the land of Israel in God's land. Also in Israel, it said, "Va'aretz lo timacher litzmitut, ki li haaretz, ki gerim v'toshavim atem mimadi." The land should not be sold in perpetuity, because the land ultimately belongs to me, and you are strangers and sojourners on the land. In other words, Bnei Israel are a kind of sharecroppers on God's land, and they are, obligated in a fair and just dividing up of the land together with God, the owner of the land. Now we're going to see Rav Meidan's kind of final, mathematical and interpretive flourish here. The Torah obligates us here in the land, he's writing in Israel, here in the land of Israel, with 2 tithes, Shnei Masrot. There are years in which we're obligated in Maaser Rishon, the first tithe, which goes to the Levi, and Maaser Sheni, a second tithe, which is sacred produce, which has to be eaten in a state of purity in Yerushalayim. That's 2 out of every 3 years, other than Shemitah, years 1 and 2, and years 4 and 5. And then there are other years when we are obligated in the first tithe to the Levi, and the second tithe is not called Maaser Sheni, but it's called Maaser Ani, a tithe for the poor. That's years 3 and 6. But it's always the case that we are obligated in 2 tithes, not 1 and not 3. 2 tithes, if a tithe means 10%, right? 2 tithes comes to a fifth of the produce. And that is what we give to the Baal HaKarka, the owner of the land, to God. And what remains for us is the 4 fifths, the 4 hands, right? I think the idea of a yad is even here that it has 5 parts. So that's why I think why the Torah even uses yad in the Egypt story, right? You'll have a chamishit goes to Paro, and arba hayadot, almost 4 of the fingers, not even hands, the 4 fifths, remain yours. So to here, right, where we give 1/5 by having 2 tithes, we wind up giving God essentially 2 10% shares. It's not precise, but it's 20%. And that's 1/5. And what remains for us is 4 yadot, 4 fifths, just like the Egyptian farmers. I think it's to me a beautiful, feels like not totally coincidental kind of insight, even if it's not to say that the Torah system was based on the Egyptian system, but that, the sense of recognizing that land is not totally ours. We owe something to the true owner of the land, and the rest is ours to benefit from, then reads nicely back into the Yosef story, where the sense is, okay, there's a beholdenness to Egypt, and there's also a recognition of significant tie, even, having sold or had to give up their land, that the Egyptians still had that entitled them to the vast majority of it, 80%. Now, final point. We agree with those who critiqued Yosef, whom we brought above, in one important point. With the passage of, so meaning, here the purpose of all this has served, for Rav Meidan to reject the criticism of Yosef that he was, just a loyal servant of Paro, following a hegemonic, self-indulgent plan to utilize, the famine followed by plenty followed by famine as an opportunity to enlarge the king's coffers and subjugate the people for the king's own benefit. And Yosef was, loyal and faithful and playing along with that. And in so doing, he's, worthy of indictment. That's the contemporary criticism. Rav Meidan is saying, I reject that. And in fact, what I see is Yosef's insight and wisdom saying, to protect the most vulnerable, we have to take this out of the capitalist economic system, and in this emergency crisis time, set up a system which will ensure that everybody will have what they need, and there can't be exceptions to that. But in so doing, we will make sure that people get the vast majority of what they work for, and establish a kind of equality and communist system. So in all of that, Rav Meidan defends Yosef from his critics. And he says, we agree with those who criticized Yosef, whom we brought above, in one important point. When the passage of generations happened, when this new, dynasty came to rule in Egypt, right, as Shmot begins, a new king arose over Egypt who knew not Joseph. The story, which was, strengthened by this new king and by the Egyptian multitudes, was that Yosef, the Hebrew slave, who, rose to greatness by coincidence in Egypt, took advantage of this famine crisis and subjugated all Egyptian citizens and all their property, to the evil, evil king and its rule over them. Right. This story then becomes a great reason for Egypt to subjugate and enslave the children of Israel, and even throw their children into the Nile, into the river. Right. So we agree that, well, we disagree with what Yosef's actual motivations were, but we agree that quickly the story gets turned against him and becomes a pretense, for harming the Jewish people. This is a, story of kind of agenda-driven and anti-Semitic bias, which can, in particular in times of crisis, substitute for the true story in every one of its details. This new interpretation ignores the problems that stood in front of Yosef when he came to apportion justly the crops amongst the masses of people hungry for food. It ignores everything Yosef did in order to save Egypt from the disgrace and horror of famine, and it ignores the law that Yosef established that was so generous for the benefit of the Egyptian tenant farmers. From interpretations like this, meaning the twisted ones, of their deeds, Jews have suffered, en masse, in all the lands of their dispersal. All their deeds to promote economic prosperity in the lands in which they live are forgotten, and in days of wrath, it's as though they had never happened. Their actions receive a negative interpretation, which confines them to, consigns them rather to disaster after disaster, until God, the Lord of their God, the God of their ancestors, showed compassion upon them and returned them to God's property and to God's land, right? So all the lands where Jews were, where they were a part of the economic system, brought prosperity, and then it was turned against them, only ever ended, maybe it didn't even end, but only were ever kind of ameliorated when the Jews then returned to God's land. And in that, I think that, Nachalatov el Arzo, God's portion and God's land, Rav Meidan is reminding us, that as he said at the beginning, that land is actually not our land, right? The result then of coming back to Medinat Yisrael is still to remind ourselves that we're coming to a land where we are, it's the land which God has promised, however we understand that in biblical history and in, modern idiom and modern meaning, but it's still the land where we are God's, guests and owe those various responsibilities and duties to God in the land. I can't resist the, I can't resist. I choose not to resist the kind of political note that, that language of some of the leaders of the incoming government of, Higia Bal Habayit, the owners of the land have come home, cuts against this message of Rav Meidan here. That while we have great responsibility for the land, ultimately there's a recognition that no one is the Baal Habayit of the land. God is the Baal Habayit of the land, and we are enjoined to, to treat it justly and steward it responsibly, which is an extremely complicated and challenging task. But just that last line reminded me of these sort of current issues of political rhetoric and political reality. So I share that thought by way of closing, and and really recognizing, and this is Rav Avi has taught a lot in the beginning of the book of Shemot, kind of how these anti-Semitic narratives and threads are spun, and that too feels very resonant in this time, as we watch people spout anti-Semitic rhetoric that comes from nowhere and is based on largely nothing that we have ever done or had anything to do with. And if it is, it's a perversion of those stories, to our detriment, that comes from some other place of hate. It's always in these times, it's always heartening, like tonight, to see New York's elected officials and leaders of all kinds stand up and acknowledge that they stand with the Jewish community. And to me, that feels true, even though we're still facing a lot of personal attack and hate all over the place. So pause here for questions, comments, reactions on the Rav Meidan piece. Again, the sort of two major pieces, sort of presenting the critique of Yosef, attempting a different reading of Yosef, that the motivation for this whole project was, communism to protect the weak, and the proof was in the pudding of it not falling prey to the typical communist traps, because Yosef ensured that the working class, which was everyone at whatever level, all got their fair share. Then porting that forward to kind of our relationship to the land in Israel today, and the notion of the 10% tithes that we take that preserve that sense that the land is not truly ours. And then coming back to recognize the way the story gets retold and how that's a classic trope in victimizing Jewish people. Questions, comments, reactions? Lance, go for it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'd like to go back to the text and look at Ramadan says, only the land of the priests bought he not, for the priests had a portion from Pharaoh, and did eat their portion which Pharaoh gave them. Therefore they sold not their land. And then a little later on, he says, it's hard for me to see. And Joseph made it a statute concerning the land of Egypt unto this day, that Pharaoh should have the fifth. Only the land of the priests alone became not Pharaoh's. Now that bothers me a lot. And the reason it bothers me is that this sounds very much like the attitude of the Hittites toward their priests. The priests worked for the king. The priests worked for the pharaohs. The Jewish priests, by contrast, work for God. And it bothers me. In other words, in this particular instance, in this particular story, you can map the priests onto Joseph. In other words, I would suggest that the priests, this whole thing about the priests is a recursive miniature of the story of Joseph here. And if you go back to the initial story of Joseph and the interpretation of dreams, Joseph makes it abundantly clear that Joseph does not interpret dreams. Who interprets dreams? Who interprets dreams?
God, hello, Elohim.
God, absolutely. Where is God in this formula? In other words, in the formula, where is God? The Ish appears suddenly to Joseph and says, go to Dothan. You know, you 2 rows of diversion of wood, and 1 road goes to Dothan. In other words, you're going to find your brothers in Dothan. The only way Joseph knows is because the Ish, the anonymous gentleman, the angel, the avatar of God comes and directs Joseph. God is directing everything. But you don't get that feel here. And the other side of the coin is communism, which, in other words, in which you have this ability to take the poor and somehow make them better than the tenant, than the owners, or whatever it is. This is absolute nonsense in terms of the ancient world. And in Mimesis, Eric Auerbach makes it very clear that it's the Christians that are the ones who say this, okay? In other words, so what Rabbi Medina is doing, in effect, is saying that this is Christian. That's just my little perspective.
Okay, thank you, and of course, spoken like a true Kohen, and good. Yes, I think a lot. I didn't, Rabbi Dan doesn't focus in on that whole part about the Kohanim. I don't know if he addresses it anywhere else, and there's definitely what to unpack there. So thank you for raising it and offering a reading of it. Absolutely. Great. Class ends early for Hanukkah, so enjoy your candles, your evening. Hanukkah Sameach. Thanks for being here. A reminder that we are off next Monday, so here's Vayigash for you for then, and we'll pick up again with Vayechi in January. And then for Shemot, my plan is to do Aviva Zornberg, Dr. Aviva Zornberg, selections from, I think it's called Particulars of Rapture on Shemot, and we'll see where we go from there for Vayikra. So looking forward to continuing. Love to Mom and Dad. Chag Sameach to all. Good night.